Okay, so did you learn a little bit more about investing? Robinhood's a place to go. I am very pleased to welcome back our good friend, Habitat for Humanity CEO and Atlanta's own Jonathan Reckford, and longtime Hope Board member Stephen Ryan. Habitat for Humanity is changing lives every day.
Well, good afternoon. I'm a pale version of John Bryant. But I've been working with John for 20 years as a volunteer at Operation Hope, and I'm on their global board, and it's a great honor to be here with you today and to introduce to you Jonathan Reckford, who's the main course of your dessert. He is the president of Habitat for the Humanities, which is one of the more remarkable international nonprofits that's done wonderful work for a series of decades. And Jonathan has been running Habitat since 2005. So he is invested in his work. I'll just give you a brief background on him. I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about his background. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Habitat. And then we're going to talk about housing and the problems of housing. And we're going to do that real fast. But he's an intriguing person. He was a minister in a Presbyterian church after a business career and before Habitat. He helped train the Korean team in the Olympics to row, and he was a rower, and you could see from his stature why he was a rower. So we're dealing with a man who's a father, a dedicated nonprofit executive who learned his skills in business. So Jonathan, it's a great thing to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Steve.
So tell us a little bit more than that capsule about yourself, and then segue on and talk about Habitat, if you will.
Thank you so much. And first, great to be with all of you in the room, real live people, as well as out in the virtual world. I had a career that never made any sense to me, but was blessed with wonderful role models. Growing up, my grandmother was a towering figure and fighter for civil rights and social justice, who challenged us every time we saw her when I was little to be useful. And that was her idea of the good life, is we're supposed to be useful. And she was one of the early women in the U.S. Congress.
Stop. This is Millicent Fenwick, who is a legend, who became a congresswoman in a period where women only went to Congress under very unusual conditions. And she was a very important congresswoman who worked on the Helsinki Accords and other really important things. So he comes from good people.
It is, and it took me a meandering path. That time in Korea was actually life-changing, and I think just to be living in an environment that was so foreign to anything I knew was a chance to really own my own faith, but also see the world in a different light. And I came back from a chance to travel after my time living in Korea all across Asia and seeing both devastating poverty and dynamism, and this is now many decades ago, and came back and went to business school with the idea of learning the skills to bring them to the nonprofit world. And back then it was not a mainstream idea that we needed professionally managed nonprofits, and I think now that is seen differently. And then went into the business world to learn. And I had the privilege of helping grow businesses for Marriott and Disney, CarMax, and then for any of you in the room who remember that young people actually used to go to the mall and buy music on plastic discs long ago. And after my company was acquired about 20 years ago, that led to the next big pivot. And my heart was really broken on a service trip to central India, all over again around injustice issues, working with the Dalits, and among the Dalits, the Bungi are really the most disadvantaged in society, only allowed to hand clean latrines or clean up dead animals, and they weren't allowed to physically live in the community. They had to be outside the walls, and about half the kids were dying by their 13th birthday because of the conditions they were living in, and it just shattered me. And the pastor who came up with the idea for Habitat for Humanity called it divine irritation, but that idea that there's sometimes where too often in society we see something that bothers us and we think, that's terrible, somebody ought to do something about that. And then we just change the channel and get distracted. And I think there are those moments where you see something and it upsets you, and the reaction is, that's terrible, and I'm going to do something about it. And you get off the couch, you get out into the community and decide you'll be a part. And I think that was a spark for me, certainly, to find my calling, which led very unexpectedly into full-time church work, which then led to Habitat for Humanity, which in a way culminated or put together everything I was hoping for. And what really drew me to Habitat, is I think what has drawn so many others, is that home is so fundamentally important. And I think for those of us who grew up in good housing, it's easy to take that for granted. And when you meet someone who hasn't had safe or adequate housing, it's a visceral issue, and so fundamental, right after food and water, in terms of the kind of life we all want to have. So Habitat for Humanity started in South Georgia and grew very quickly in a grassroots way, locally owned all over the world. And it has grown thanks to millions and millions of people who captured the vision. To last year, we helped about 5.9 million people in 73 countries, and our total revenue is about 2.3 billion. We have got some music. Thank you. And most of the core principles of Habitat are so aligned with Operation Hope's goals as well, which is we believe first that everyone should have a safe, decent, and affordable place to live, and our particular niche within housing is affordable home ownership. We certainly don't argue that everyone should own a home, but what we have seen is, in many ways, the chance to earn that equity over time and the safety and stability of decent housing has been a springboard for so many people over generations, and particularly for low-income and low-income people of color. Owning a home has been the best way to create a financial asset, an intergenerational asset over time. And so the principles of Habitat have always been with, not for. We partner with the families. They purchase the homes. They put in sweat equity. They're trained in financial literacy and home maintenance before they purchase their homes. And then they literally help build their homes and their neighbors' homes. And that's not a construction strategy, but that's really a social and community strategy to create transformation. So a little bit there.
So wonderful work. Let's take a step back from Habitat and look at the U.S. housing market now, and particularly the housing market for Black families who have never owned a home before. What's that experience look like now, and is home ownership still what we think it is, the best path to the middle class?
Thanks, Steve. If I answered in reverse order, I still think the answer is yes, but the ability to attain that has gotten far more difficult. And I think you all know, I would say COVID revealed and exacerbated an existing housing affordability crisis. So even before COVID, we had 18 million families paying over 50% of their income on rent or mortgage. And then if you're doing that, obviously that creates unacceptable choices about what else you can then afford. And the standard nationally and globally is that you shouldn't spend more than about 30% of your income on housing. And then what happened unusually with COVID is incomes went down for the bottom third of our population and housing prices exploded. Usually housing prices would come down in a downturn, but as everybody wanted more housing to shelter in place, it actually forced prices up. So we've had extraordinary price acceleration, and that's just made the math almost impossible for families trying to save a down payment and then to be able to afford the current housing prices. Here in Atlanta, my hometown, is a great example. Housing prices on the more affordable side of town have tripled in the last 3 years. And we are seeing what had historically been a very affordable city increasingly be out of reach for far too many families. And I think that is, it's ultimately a supply problem, that we are not building enough housing to meet the demands in our metros.
So let's talk about that supply problem, because as I think you've pointed out in various things that you've written or talked about, that the lack of supply doesn't mean if someone's given a voucher but there's no place to rent, then you're competing and driving the price of the rental up, as opposed to if government policy encourages the creation of new housing. Could you talk about the challenges of that, both at the federal and at the local level? What are the drivers of a government policy that we need to have a greater housing supply?
Well, I think I'll start with federal, and obviously it's a very timely issue right now as Congress is debating the Build Back Better Act and figuring out what's in it. Obviously, we believe housing should be a priority within that. We actually argue that housing is infrastructure, if you think about it. But there's no country in the world that has solved housing without a significant federal investment in it. And so challenge on the supply side is if we don't find incentives to build more and build in the right places, the danger is we'll keep exacerbating. Today, because of the supply constraints and cheap money and private actors buying up houses, all of those have created these accelerated price moves. So if the danger, and we think we should have enough vouchers for everybody who needs a housing voucher, but we've got to make sure there are enough units out there to be able to go rent. So the first is, can we make sure that people have the financial ability to rent or buy? The second is, it's important where the housing is. And we have learned over and over again, whether this is Cambodia or Malawi or Atlanta, that the most successful communities are mixed income. And the best model for equity in our country and world are for children to grow up in mixed income communities, but we haven't designed them that way. And you have to acknowledge the role of race in this, that the federal government mandated racial restrictions, and local cities all around the country, all over the country, zoned in a way to keep out both low income and particularly low income people of color. And we've got to figure out how to change those zoning rules, because in some ways the pressure on gentrification would go down if it was easier to move into communities of opportunity. But if you get displaced and can't move anywhere, then it's absolutely natural to resist, in some cases, really needed investments in local communities. So we think the best model is actually mixed income everywhere in a city, across the whole city. That means the federal government has a role to play in finance, but the local government has a huge role to play in zoning, and we've got to really tackle both sides of it.
So let's talk about that political dynamic, because we had a tale of 2 years last year. The first half of the year was given over to social justice and thinking about what the Floyd and other cases meant, and the business community supporting more social justice initiatives. The second half of the year looked like the revenge of the empire, where other people felt loose to say racially indiscreet things, to have groups that are racially indiscreet tearing down the banners of black churches in Washington before they marched on the Capitol. So how do we get zoning changes when people equate protecting their real estate investment with not allowing low-income housing in their area? How does that work?
I think, sadly, this is a huge challenge, and the only way it works is everyone participating. In a way, it's why Habitat cares so much about volunteers. We, pre-COVID, engaged about 1.5 million volunteers in our work directly, and that's not because it's the most efficient way to build homes. How many of you in the room have ever built with Habitat? So, quite a few hands going up for those in virtual land. It is, we may have some really skilled construction people in the room, but if you're like me, for me, the reason I loved building before I ever joined Habitat was you experienced community in a way that is so rare now, where people are all coming together, and it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter what your income is, and you're doing it in relationship. And if we don't do that, I think we have to make it personal for people, because right now, whether it's a blue state or city or a red state or city, uniformly people will resist allowing housing that's affordable for low and moderate income families to be built in their community. And California, a very blue state, it's not just NIMBY, not in my backyard, it's banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And it's become almost impossible to build, and therefore the prices are ridiculously high. And the math just doesn't work at all for families. And ultimately, that's not sustainable. So if you care about the environment, you don't want to have 80% of your city not living in your city because all the roads are then choked in traffic. If you want health, you want to make sure that people actually have safe housing to live in. And certainly if we want racial equity, it is so critical that we actually create paths of opportunity. And it's very hard to have those paths of opportunity without dealing with housing. It's certainly not the only need, but in many ways it's a prerequisite for all the other pieces that we want for a decent society. So in some ways, I have seen real transformation happen globally and locally when somebody who may not have ever been even to the other side of their own city builds a meaningful relationship with someone who has all the same hopes, same dreams, same aspirations, just hasn't had the same opportunities. And I think then suddenly it's not those people, it creates a face of the people who want the same chances we all want.
So Jonathan, I just heard you say something. I'm trying to ape John Bryant, by the way, just to let you know. You were saying in effect that the volunteers help create the political force to obtain the zoning changes that you need in order to do it, so that it is not just the joy of their involvement and their feeling of involvement, but there's a political effect of that.
That's very much our strategy. So what our hope, in some ways, it was the scariest thing we did. We shifted from a strategy of how many houses can we build, which was a really good goal, to what would it take to meaningfully reduce the housing deficit in all the geographies we serve, which was a scarier thing, because it really forced a mindset shift, which was we want to engage volunteers so that not they won't be celebrate and be done after their volunteer experience, but we want that volunteer experience to be an on-ramp so that they will help us create the policy enabling environment locally, statewide, federally, so that then we can actually change policies so that the market will work better for low and moderate income families. And then how do we, much as the theme of this conference has been, open up lending so that banks will actually lend to families? How do we help those families get qualified and ready, and then create an environment where Habitat and other builders can build more housing that's affordable? Because today, even if you're a good-hearted builder, whether nonprofit or for-profit, the math doesn't work to build something that's actually affordable for a family making even 2 minimum wages to be able to purchase or rent. So we have got to figure out how to solve the math problem together, and either that's got to be land or it's got to be in financing.
Well, in 2050, 70% of the world's population are going to live in cities. That's going to be the first time in human history we've had that degree of concentration. And in the rest of the world, there won't be power, there won't be water, and there won't be sewage for those people. So Jonathan, as you look at your international billet of activity, the challenges for you and your organization are extraordinary. But thank you for being here today and sharing this with us. Unlike John, I'm going to keep on time and give back to the next speaker. But let's hear a real round of applause for Habitat and for Jonathan Reckford.
Great to be with you all.